expect to find from the descriptions in the Gospels. The scourging, for example. The shape and size match archaeological discoveries of the flagrum favoured by the Romans in the 1st century. Likewise, the wound in the side matches the size and shape of the Roman lance. But for Dr. Svensson, the most telling details are the wounds where the body was nailed to the cross.
A Roman crucifixion began with fixing the arms at the crossbeam, called patibulum. And if we look at the man in the shroud, we see here at the wrists a big wound with blood rivulets in 2 directions.
It's interesting because I suppose when one thinks of the normal pictures and representations, one, I suppose, is used to seeing pictures of a nail through the palm itself, but here we're actually looking at the back surface of the wrist rather than the palm.
It's possible,
and
yes.
You get much more support if you're going through the bony structures of the wrist rather than, say, soft tissue in the palm, which may not be sufficiently capable of bearing weight.
The wounds on the feet also confirm that this was a Roman crucifixion.
The Romans crucified their victims by nailing them through the heel, and this man was pierced by the heel because we see a large outflow of blood from here.
The blood stains on the shroud are consistent with this practical way of nailing, the way we now know to be the Roman way. So no one has yet worked out how the image was formed, and there's evidence that places the shroud earlier in time. In the 12th century, in the 5th century, and even in the 1st century. The conflict of evidence is such that the team in Colorado is asking whether the results of the 1988 carbon-14 test could have been distorted. Up there in the stratosphere is where the carbon-14 isotope is created as the cosmic rays hit the atmosphere. And since the shroud was tested 20 years ago, more is known about its transition from there to the plants from which the linen is made. Based on this new knowledge, Jackson and his team have developed a new hypothesis that could explain why the age of the shroud sample tested 20 years ago is younger than the rest of the evidence would suggest. Scientists have now discovered that before it's absorbed into carbon dioxide, the carbon-14 isotope actually spends up to 2 months in the atmosphere as carbon monoxide. If the carbon monoxide bonded with the linen of the shroud, it could have made the cloth appear younger. In fact, a 2% contamination is all it would take to distort the age of the cloth by 1,300 years.
Let me understand you in layman's terms, right? If you can establish here that there has been this contamination of the material, it would mean that the shroud material would have been therefore dated much earlier than it actually is.
Well, it would mean that the radiocarbon dating of the shroud would have dated a contaminated sample that would mean that the radiocarbon date was incorrect.
The team is now getting ready to begin the long process of testing the new hypothesis. Using samples of modern linen, the team plan to carry out a series of tests to find out whether its true age can be distorted. The experiments will take some time. They need to submit the samples to all the possible conditions that the Shroud of Turin itself could have been subjected to. Its storage, extreme heat, ultraviolet light, handling, water, and so on. The tests could help resolve the anomaly at the heart of the study of the shroud. The time has come to ask Professor Christopher Ramsey at the Oxford Radiocarbon Unit.
the hypotheses which John Jackson has come up with do have any validity scientifically, and they do stand up to experiment, they will have much wider implications as well for other samples which might have gone through the same process. So it's, it's part of the scientific inquiry to continue to investigate possible ways of improving techniques and so on.
The Oxford laboratory has agreed to test the samples being prepared by Jackson's team, and the first batch of samples of linen in normal storage conditions is ready for Professor Ramsey to test. How have these preliminary samples tested? And does Professor Ramsey feel there is any future for this investigation?
The significance of this particular hypothesis for contamination was that it's the first that's had the capability, at least in principle, of shifting the date by a very large amount without very much contamination. And so that's why we were doing these experiments to try to see if carbon monoxide from the atmosphere would react with linen in the way that you would have to have for this hypothesis to work. The samples that we've had so far, which have been in fairly sort of normal conditions, heated linen and stored with carbon monoxide, we haven't yet seen any evidence of reaction between the carbon monoxide and the linen. So far, there's nothing in this hypothesis that would appear to undermine the original radiocarbon emitting measurements. So the question is there something very particular about the shroud itself and the conditions in which it's been stored, which makes those reactions many tens of thousands of times faster than we can register with the material we have so far. So I guess the search is on to see if that's the case. With the radiocarbon measurements and with all of the other evidence which we have about the shroud, there does seem to be a conflict in the interpretation of the different evidence. And for that reason, I think that everyone who's worked in this area, radiocarbon scientists and all of the other experts, need to have a critical look at the evidence that they've come up with in order for us to try to work out some kind of a coherent story that fits and tells us the truth of the history of this intriguing cloth.
Whatever the outcome of the new tests, new questions about the shroud will emerge. Could its image be the work of an artist from an earlier age? Or could it have wrapped the corpse of Christ? What did happen to the shrouds we know existed in the 1st, 5th and 12th centuries? And how was the image on the cloth formed? The mysteries linger on.